getting to share a little bit about themselves and getting to know other people. Hopefully you're getting a good variety of members as we keep switching up the breakout rooms. Awesome.
While we're waiting, I have a quick answer to your question, Abby. I think I heard you say dispensa de paz, which would mean pantry of peace. I think you were asking for a translation.
All right. We are going to move on from that activity and talk a little bit about quarterly reporting.
Yes. So as AmeriCorps members, you are going to have some quarterly reporting to do. We have the quarterly dates listed on this slide. So December 31st, and then March 31st, June 30th, August 19th. These dates will also be on the calendar in the map. So if you forget the dates, when in doubt, go to the map. They will be on there. You will also be getting other reminders from us as well. So what do you have to report on? There are three main things. The first is going to be your great story. I will go over what a great story is in just a little bit. This great story is completed in Encore, so the same platform where you do your timesheets. Second is volunteers. So you'll have to report volunteers that you managed and or recruited. Shelly will be going over volunteer information a little bit later. And then the third task is going to be to review your member service plan. And if there are any updates to the member service plan, you will do it at that time. We are going to cover the member service plan tomorrow along with supervisors because both members and host site supervisors provide input into the member service plan. So it just makes sense for us to cover it with all of you at once. So with that, let's go to the next slide and we can talk a little bit more about great stories. All right, so great stories. These stories, like I said, you find them in Encore, you find the great story tab in Encore, and that's where you will write down your great story. So they can really be about anything that stands out to you during that particular quarter of service. So sometimes members are going to share about an impactful moment that they had during their service, maybe like an aha moment. Sometimes they will write about different challenges that they have faced, how they've overcome challenges, or what they are doing to overcome the particular challenge. Sometimes they just write about how service has impacted their life. Again, anything that you feel is impactful that you want to share with us. So this great story here is from a member from our past service term, and she just wrote kind of what a typical great story does look like. So usually we see it in paragraph form like this, just talking about service and how it has impacted them and how service is going overall. So I'm not going to read it to you. You can all read it if you would like. But just that's basically a generic great story. There are no requirements, like it doesn't need to be a certain length or anything like that. But we do enjoy reading them, and just know that anything that you put in your great story could potentially be shared with Serve Wisconsin, which is our state program, and even America's Service Commission, the national program. So sometimes we do share really awesome, great stories with those agencies as well. So on the great story, you'll see it's submitted by and the name. The program is always going to be MCHS Public Health AmeriCorps Community Corps. The story name, so give whatever your great story is a name. The reporting period, this member wrote Q1, so it's quarter one reporting, put the date down, and then attachments. So if you have any photos or anything that you want to include as attachments, you absolutely can. We love photos. We said that yesterday. But if you are just typing up a great story, don't type it up in a Word document and then put it as an attachment. Just put the text right in that text box. That just makes things a little bit easier. And then on the next slide, we have another example of a great story. So this is a great story Oh yeah, and Emily actually wrote it in the chat that Carol wrote a beautiful poem last year. So this is a great story that Carol wrote last year, and she got very creative with it. So your great story doesn't necessarily have to be a paragraph. If you are somebody that is creative and you want to do a poem, go ahead. If you want to do a picture or something like that, like whatever you want to do for your great story is totally fine with us as long as you are completing the great story. And we understand what you are talking about in the great story. Yeah,
In the
so awesome
past,
job, Carol. Go ahead,
in the
Shelley, sorry.
past, sure. I had a member who was placed at a recycling center, and she took various materials and she created an AmeriCorps windmill. And in her great story, she attached a photo and a video of it, and it was really awesome. So that was her great story. Others have done collages and drawings, poetry, like Carol has here. So
Yes. Any questions at all on great stories? You'll find more info about great stories also in the map too. But just remember, you do need to complete a great story for every quarter that you are serving in AmeriCorps.
We will send out reminders before the quarterly reports are due. So pay, like I said, I think yesterday, pay attention to our emails. We will remind you, but you're more than welcome to enter your great stories at any time. How about a haiku? Definitely, go for it.
I don't know my types of poems. Like I don't know the difference between like what a haiku is, and I don't even know what the other ones are called. But yeah, go for it. Whatever. If you are a creative person like that, absolutely. We love to see things like that.
you have an English teacher cringing somewhere, Allison.
No, I know. I do. My
I
background's
can't say
biology.
it
I don't
either.
know.
But I feel like isn't that there's 3 lines in a haiku? Am I getting that? Yeah, okay, I know a little bit. And does anybody, this is bonus question, but does anyone know the type of poem that Carol wrote? Doesn't that have a name?
Lauren has her
Lauren?
hand up.
It's an acrostic poem, so each
No.
letter of the line spells a word down the side. And a haiku is based on syllables. It's 3 lines. It's 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second line, and 5 syllables in the third line. We could talk poem types all day.
I have such high expectations now. I want to see a poem from you, Lauren. Like
I can probably make it happen. I can make it happen.
We all know who our content expert is on poems now, so. All right, no more questions about great stories. Great. Shelley's up with talking about our volunteer report.
All right, so this is one of the quarterly requirements. Every AmeriCorps member in the state of Wisconsin also carries the responsibility of helping their host site better utilize volunteers or recruit additional volunteers. So in an effort to increase the capacity of your organization, volunteers are a great solution, but volunteers take effort, time, planning, and so we are hoping that you will be able to commit a little of your time to making the experience of the volunteers that are at your host site like a 5-star experience. So if you reflect back to when you were a volunteer, I'm assuming everyone has had an opportunity to volunteer. Maybe you haven't, but some volunteer opportunities have just been a lot more enjoyable than others. And so what makes them good is probably has to do with the climate of the organization, how welcome they made you feel, how appreciated, how meaningful the work was, and if you can see the impact of what you do. So when you first get to your host site, you'll probably take a low key, I'm learning, but pay particular attention to their volunteer program, the tone of the volunteer program, and how volunteers respond there. And I think you might have an opportunity to make some really helpful suggestions as an outsider with a fresh viewpoint to look in. So anyway, just a little, I can't remember who was it that was going on about poetry, but I could go on about volunteer management a little longer than I need to. But every quarter then, you are going to tell us approximately how many volunteers at your host site or your organization that you interacted with, that you engaged with, that you hopefully made a more positive experience, and or perhaps you even recruited them fresh. So either way, whether they're an existing volunteer, but it became your job to check them in, to make sure that they had all the tools they needed to be successful while they were there. Maybe you organize some appreciation event at some point for your volunteers. So you would count the volunteers that were part of that. There are many organizations that have multiple members, and that'll get a little bit tricky because you don't want each of you to count the same volunteer. That would be like double counting. So a kind of a common practice where there are more than one AmeriCorps members serving is that one member reports for the whole team. So if that be the case, think about who would be the, does it make sense? Maybe actually has volunteer coordinator as part of their job title. Your goal is pretty low for most organizations to engage with at least 5 volunteers at your organization for and those volunteers should be serving for 3, 5, 10 hours, whatever. You'll tell us how many times they are. So we divide volunteers into 2 groups. This is down at the bottom. Those volunteers that come just once or twice, they're one and dones. They show up, they do something once, and there's no real expectation that you'll ever see them again. We call them episodic volunteers. A lot of your event volunteers are episodic. And then we have ongoing. These are our gold, but they're harder and harder to secure these days. Volunteers who commit, they may work at every event that you have or most all events. They may work 3 days a week at your organization. We're defining ongoing. This is our definition. This is not anyone else's definition of an ongoing volunteer, but anyone who's volunteered 3 or more times during your service term. Okay.
Question in the chat, and then we'll get to Carol.
Family members, children, spouse, those all count as volunteers. Absolutely. There's no age limit. Motivation is not a factor. If somebody's required to volunteer, you count them just as those who voluntarily come forth and say, I want to help.
Okay.
Carol, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, like I have a group of HOSA students, and if they volunteer to make blankets for, for Humane Society or for the blankets for a CBRF. So that is the test they did was a one time, but I'm working with those students all year. What do I put them? That's what I'm asking.
Well, maybe the first time they volunteer, you put them in episodic because they might not come back. If it's a group that, it's optional whether they show or not. And then once they show up the third time, it's fairly easy in our tracking sheet just to copy and paste them down into the ongoing. Does that make sense? Like the first time you are working with somebody, you don't, unless they've already got a schedule and have made some sort of a verbal commitment and they're coming back, then go ahead and put them in ongoing. But the first time someone volunteers, could be the only time. Start them at episodic. It's easy to move them on it's just a spreadsheet. But in Carol's example, each of those students that choose to volunteer can be counted.
Thank you.
Deanna, you have a question?
Yeah, so this one, I guess, is more specific to at Beaver Creek. We have 6 of us at the whole
Yeah.
site.
Mhm.
But some of us are like in different departments. Would you want a volunteer list from like the different departments, or one of our AmeriCorps is actually like the volunteer coordinator? Would you just
Coordinator.
want, okay, just have her do it?
It's up to you, whatever works easiest. We're just concerned that we don't get any double counts done. And
Right.
so, you know, be in your team, you'll know which way is the easiest way to report for us.
Okay, perfect.
Luke, do you have a question?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I know some of our volunteers do double dip, like Gianna said, at Beaver Creek. I have a lot of my bird banders and public outreach doing programs too, and then they'll go and they'll help out with the butterfly house like they did this summer. So do you want us to count those hours separate, or those volunteers fit them into one department or the other?
Yeah, you'll need to take out the duplicates, but you can count the hours for that volunteer regardless of where they are.
Okay.
So you have a really established volunteer programs, and many of you will be serving at organizations that have used volunteers extensively for some time, and they will already have tracking systems. They could be really expensive software that they've been utilizing. So what we're about to show you is a really simple tracking spreadsheet. You don't have to use this if you already can give us the information we need, how many unique volunteers, not double counted, volunteered with your organization that quarter, and then what were the number of hours. And so our tracking sheet allows you to do that by event. So I guess Beaver Creek, it's up to you, just as long as you can get the information, the number of volunteers, and then how many hours each of those volunteers did. It's up to you if you do them by department or some other way. Let's look at the tracking sheet then.
You want me to
Before
come
we
back?
look at the tracking
Oh.
sheet.
Like I can skip ahead.
No, gosh, I have the PowerPoint over here. I'm not referring to it. So Sophie so kindly gave us a sneak peek of what we can find about to help us with this volunteer efforts that's located in the maps, in MAP. And this would be resources. No, boy, I'm going to let you tell us where it is, Sophie.
Resources, and then way at the bottom, volunteers is the very last tab on your resources tab.
Okay, so the actual tracking spreadsheet, there's a link there. That's where you would find what we call a volunteer report. And then there was like a guide sheet that's part of that spreadsheet. Is that like the second tab? Maybe? Okay. And then there are additional resources down at the bottom that can help you as a volunteer coordinator. Sometimes you just need paper check-in sheets, and then you use those as your source data to put them into your volunteer report. There's a toolkit. This volunteer management toolkit has all sorts of forms that a traditional volunteer program needs to have. Starting with probably one of the most important documents you could create is your position description for your volunteer. What, a position description? Isn't that a little overly formalized? Heck no. Volunteers, just like anyone else, want to know what are the expectations, who do they need to report to, what are the benefits of volunteering here, all the sort of things that are in a traditional position description. So a strong volunteer program will have position descriptions. You can find a sample form in that toolkit. And lastly, then there is just a tip sheet for recruitment. If it frightens you to think about what I have to get new volunteers to join, sometimes it's really simple. It's figuring out where is your local volunteer center that can help drive traffic, send volunteers to you and kind of increase your reach and making some postings there, and that will bring in volunteers. So our department is located in Marshfield. Marshfield has a United Way that operates a volunteer center, and people who are living in the Marshfield area know that if you are interested in volunteering, there's certain places you just know. Oh, hospitals, libraries, humane societies, they always seem to need volunteers. You don't necessarily need a way to get in, but what about all those other like volunteer opportunities you don't really know about or hear about that are unique? So people in Marshfield know, check with United Way. They'll send you to the volunteer center. There's somebody there that can custom match a volunteer to the available opportunities. And so we have about 12 volunteer centers across the state. If there's one in your area that serves your county, your city, your geographic area, you'll want to make sure that you are represented. Your opportunities are on there. So that's just a great one of many recruitment tips. Here is a peek at that volunteer spreadsheet. We call it a volunteer report. Starting way at the top, place for you to put your name and your program, Community Corps, Recovery Corps, and then this is the top half of the report. The top half is where episodic volunteers are recorded. Now, some of you will use all of these lines and run out of space. Not a problem. You can copy and paste as many as you need to. It's a never-ending spreadsheet, but they're very simple. First and last name. The only reason we will never contact any of these individuals, we're not asking for contact information. And if you're hesitant about sharing last names, it's fine to use just a first initial of a last name. But this is how we can tell that we aren't double counting. We can do a quick sort and make sure there aren't duplicates here. Of course, we expect you to do that before you send it in. So the name of the volunteer, next column in red is, and I'm going to look at that arrow, don't write in the red cells. These contain formulas and they will do math for you. All right. So we're going to jump to what's the date of the volunteer event that this volunteer came to. And then really briefly, just a word or two, what's the event activity? So you kind of track what they did, where they were, and then how many hours. You can, up hours, that's up to you. You could round it to the nearest whole hour, half hour, quarter hour. No real guideline on that. Just be consistent. And then the color changes to white. If that volunteer comes back for a second event, you date it. What did they do? And then how many hours were they there? And again, remember, you might have some sign-in forms that volunteers use. That's one of the resources that are found, and that might help you fill this information in because you'll need some sort of data tracking. All right, so what happens then? They show up a third time. Heavens, now they're not an episodic volunteer. So highlight the row, copy, and you're going to paste. And let's take you can see, scroll down for ongoing table. So we scroll down right below. The table is exactly the same. It just has a lot more columns. We don't know how many events. I think we set this up for 50 events. Some members rarely, but some members have used more than 50. So again, the name, when they volunteered, what they did, and how many hours. And then some volunteers will go way across and some will just have 3, 4, 5 down here. And as those volunteers add events, that red column will increment and increase for number of total hours. And then the whole column totals, And then the two totals, that total episodic and total ongoing, gets down in that grand total down there. So this should not be an expectation that causes anybody any undue stress, because it's a team goal. So if Dave just isn't there when it comes to volunteer recruitment and managing, if at the YMCA they just have 0 volunteers, and despite everything Dave does, he can't find anybody to come in and volunteer, it isn't anything that he has to think, oh, this is going to be a black mark against my name as an AmeriCorps member, because thank goodness Sigourney is going to just excel at the Girl Scouts, and she is going to get all sorts of volunteers and more than that 5, which is her personal goal. And so she kind of covers for Dave. And so it's a big aggregate, and we have a team goal, and we'll give you updates on how close we are. So although we want all of you to focus a little bit on the volunteers, help improve the experience, maybe bring in some new volunteers so that when you're gone, you've still helped increase capacity there, even though you've left when your term is over. So we still want that to be as a goal, but if you're just not successful, sometimes it's hard, but just know that others are going to overachieve and most likely will be in a good position. In a quarterly report, if you have no volunteers, you will still submit a report and tell us no volunteers. And, in essence, simply so that we know that you just didn't skip submitting it. It's just that you really do have 0. There is always one question at the end of our volunteer report survey that has nothing to do with volunteers. It just asks you to share with us any successes or challenges that you had this quarter. Might have nothing to do with volunteers, but so there is something for everybody to submit in that volunteer report, quarterly report. And before we leave this document here, you're going to maintain this document, or you might be using your organization's volunteer management software that collects similar data, and you won't submit this to us until the end of the term. So come August of 2024, you'll submit your Q4 report, tell us how many volunteers and hours, but then you will attach this document or something similar so that we actually have verification that you weren't just pulling numbers out of the air. Not that anyone would have ever thought to do that, but so hold on to this, maintain it. We don't collect it until the end of the term. My most regular volunteer refused to give me her last name. Okay. She who remains nameless would have been her last name. Any other questions? All right, have fun. And if you have a specific challenge with a volunteer or a strategy to get something accomplished, let me know, because I have had some experience as a volunteer center director at a United Way in Wausau for a number of years prior to taking this position, and would love to would love to help. So I also have some books and resources that might be helpful I could send your way.
That was a modest explanation, Shelley. Shelley is very well versed in volunteer management, so please don't hesitate to reach out to her.
Thank you, Megan.
All right, if there's no questions on the volunteer report, we will keep moving.
This ties in with volunteerism in a way. We already talked about 9/11 being a National Day of Service. The other official National Day of Service is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and that's always on the second Monday. No, must not be the second. It's an early Monday in January. This coming January, it's January 15th. And MLK Day is a day of service that AmeriCorps actually takes the lead on. So we get lots of push to have our members organize MLK Day events. And so when you think about it, I mean, David Nelson talked about a famous quote of Martin Luther King that he finds inspiring. And then you think about, like, have you heard about a lot of Martin Luther King Day events happening in your communities? They're not as plentiful as, well, as we would hope. It's a federal holiday. There's many schools that take the day off, and that's also another slogan, is make it a day on, not a day off, a day on to do service. So we're going to encourage you to complete at least one National Day of Service by doing something above and beyond. It can be something very personal. It could be something you just do in your own neighborhood, or you know, something that isn't organized by a nonprofit. It could be just an effort that you do to make a difference in your community, or it could be something larger. You could go to your volunteer center, find out what events are happening, and sign up and participate in one of those. So whichever way you respond, we want you to do something for a National Day of Service during your AmeriCorps term. Other optional days that you can meet this requirement, they're not official National Days of Service, but they are great days of service nationwide, really. The fourth Saturday in every October is officially Make a Difference Day. And this actually has turned out to be one of the largest days of service across the country every year. And in our communities, they often tend to be raking projects, because the fourth Saturday in October, we're usually dealing with a lot of yards that need raking, and seniors who are worried and concerned about how all those leaves are going to get off their yard. So there's probably going to be plenty of raking projects across the state that you can participate in, but it could be doing anything. But there's a lot of options there. You don't have to organize, but you might decide to. National Volunteer Week is April 21st through the 27th in 2024. And because you are touching the lives of volunteers at your organization, we would naturally think that you might want to be involved in organizing or helping plan something that makes your volunteers feel special. And it's always so heartwarming to hear what members are doing during National Volunteer Week. Some sites go way crazy. I know that the Volunteer Services Department at the hospital in Marshfield actually celebrates it all month long. And those members spent tons and tons of hours doing special events and making the week fun for all their volunteers. So something doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be a dinner out. I've heard somebody had rented a movie theater and all their volunteers got to go for a free movie and popcorn. I mean, you know, be creative. Think about what might appeal to your volunteers. Honestly, sometimes it's just a heartfelt thank you. We really appreciate you. And we want to share with you the impact that all of our volunteers are making. And so knowing that your work is worthwhile, your time is being well spent, that can be the best form of gratitude for sure. So how will we know if you do this? Well, we did allude to a member service plan. It is located in the member service plan, and you will indicate when you've completed it in your member service plan. You can also use, we have a reflections in our Encore program, similar to Great Stories, but it's a different location. And we particularly look there, especially for Martin Luther King Jr. Day, because Serve Wisconsin, our state commission, always likes to feature any member who does a special project for Martin Luther King Jr. Day in their monthly newsletter. And so that's the easiest way for us to get that information of who was active. So we'll remind you when we get close. Just keep that in your kind of your rear periphery that this is coming up.
Any questions on National Days of Service?
Those,
Carol?
yeah, those dates are on our calendar, all of the dates.
They should be.
I'm
Sophie's
not sure if,
checking.
yes, I'm not sure if Make a Difference Day is. I can certainly add it. I believe National Volunteer Week is there, but I know 9/11 and MLK Day are. So I will double check for you, Carol, and if they're not there, I will definitely add them.
Thank you so much.
There's
And I guess
anything
I
we're
can-
missing, just reach out because our calendar was just freshly built. So
Yeah.
happy to update.
And although these events have days, that doesn't mean you can't do an event before or after, you know, within a reasonable amount of time. That's wholeheartedly, you know, it's the effort that's made. It's not necessarily the date.
There are no more questions. We are due for a break. We'll take a 17-minute break and come back at 2:30.